Before we begin, write in the comments which city and country you're watching us from. This channel exists to record stories that should never have been forgotten. The summer of 1856 descended upon New Orleans, Louisiana, with a suffocating humidity that turned the air itself into something tangible, something you could almost drink. The city sprawled along the Mississippi River's crescent bend, a cosmopolitan jewel of the Deep South where French, Spanish, English and African cultures collided in markets and ballrooms and slave pens. New Orleans was the largest slave market in North America, a place where human beings were bought and sold by the thousands, where fortunes were made in flesh, where the peculiar institution of slavery reached its most profitable and its most brutal expression. Yet it was also a place where the rigid racial categories of the plantation South became complicated, where free people of color owned property and businesses, where enslaved persons sometimes purchased their own freedom, where the boundaries between slave and free, black and white, were policed with violence precisely because they threatened to dissolve without constant reinforcement. In the archive of Xavier University of Louisiana, there exists a remarkable collection of documents known as the Beaumont Papers. Letters, business records, and personal journals belonging to the Beaumont family, French Creole merchants who operated a shipping concern in the New Orleans Port District. The papers were donated to the university in 1952 by a descendant who had discovered them in an attic trunk, and they lay mostly unexamined until a graduate student cataloging the collection in 1984 discovered something extraordinary: extensive documentation of an enslaved young man named Gabriel Prosper, whose intellectual abilities were so remarkable that even his owners could not fully suppress or ignore them. The first substantive mention of Gabriel appears in a letter dated June 3, 1856, written by François Beaumont to his brother Henri, who managed the family's business interests in Mobile, Alabama. Henri, I write to tell you about an acquisition I have made that may prove either extraordinarily valuable or dangerously problematic. I cannot yet determine which. At the slave market yesterday, I purchased a young Negro man, approximately 19 years of age, light-complexioned, sold from an estate in Virginia after his former master's death. The auctioneer listed him as Gabriel, house servant, literate, some French, and set a reserve price of $200. High for a man so young, but the literacy alone justified the premium, as you know how valuable it is to have servants who can read instructions and correspondence. But Henri, this young man is something far beyond the usual educated house servant. During the inspection period before auction, I tested his literacy by having him read a passage from a French commercial contract. He read it fluently, with proper pronunciation and clear comprehension. Then, and this is what convinced me to bid higher than I had planned, he translated it into English extemporaneously, preserving not just the literal meaning, but the legal nuances and technical terminology. Intrigued, I tested him further. I spoke to him in Spanish, asking about his background. He responded in fluent Spanish with a distinctly Castilian accent, not the crude pidgin one might expect. I then switched to Italian, a language I know only moderately, and asked him to translate between Italian and English. He did so without hesitation, correcting my own Italian grammar in the process, though he was respectful in how he made the correction. Henri, this Negro speaks at least 4 languages fluently, English, French, Spanish, and Italian, and demonstrates understanding of Latin as well, based on his explanation of certain legal terms. When I asked how he acquired such learning, he said only that his former master in Virginia had allowed him access to books, that he had taught himself languages by reading whatever texts he could acquire, and that he possesses what he called a memory that retains everything I read or hear. I purchased him for $1,150, nearly twice the reserve price, but several other buyers had recognized his value. I intend to employ him in the counting house, where his linguistic abilities will be useful for our international commerce. But I confess, I am also simply fascinated by him. How does a slave boy from Virginia acquire mastery of multiple languages? What kind of mind can teach itself languages from books alone? And most troubling, what dangers might such a mind pose if it turns against those who hold it in bondage? François Beaumont's letter captures both the recognition of Gabriel's extraordinary abilities and the immediate anxiety that such abilities provoked. A young, enslaved man who could speak multiple European languages, who understood commercial law, who demonstrated intellectual capabilities that exceeded those of most educated white men. This was both valuable property and potential threat, an asset that required constant surveillance. The subsequent documents in the Beaumont Papers provide a remarkably detailed portrait of Gabriel Prosper over the following years. Unlike many enslaved persons whose lives remain largely undocumented, Gabriel's unusual position in the Beaumont household, working in the commercial office, handling correspondence, translating documents, meant his activities were frequently mentioned in letters and business records. Through these fragmentary references, we can reconstruct both his abilities and the impossible situation those abilities created. Prosper's will, filed in Louisiana County, includes the notation, "I bequeath to my daughter Catherine the mulatto boy Gabriel, born to my property Sarah in the year 1837, said boy having been educated in languages and letters at my direction as an experiment in the intellectual capacity of the Negro race." This single sentence reveals something crucial. Gabriel's education was not accidental or self-directed initially, but rather the result of what his master termed an experiment. Edmund Prosper, apparently, was testing whether enslaved persons could be educated to high levels, a question debated among slaveholders, some of whom believed education would make enslaved persons more valuable and manageable, while others feared it would make them dangerous and rebellious. Gabriel Prosper was born into slavery in Louisiana County, Virginia, around 1837. The circumstances of his birth are documented only indirectly through estate papers from his original owner, a planter named Edmund Prosper, who died in 1855. The results of Prosper's experiment exceeded anything he could have anticipated. By the time Gabriel was a teenager, according to later testimony, he had mastered Latin, Greek, French, Spanish, and Italian, in addition to English. He had read extensively in classical literature, philosophy, history, and law. He could recite lengthy passages from memory after a single reading. He demonstrated what modern psychologists would recognize as both hyperlexia and eidetic memory, the ability to read and comprehend at extraordinary speed and to retain essentially everything he encountered. But Edmund Prosper died in 1855, and his daughter Catherine, inheriting Gabriel, immediately recognized the danger of keeping such an educated slave in Virginia. The Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831 had made Virginians deeply suspicious of educated enslaved persons, and by the 1850s, laws against slave literacy were being enforced with increasing severity. Catherine Prosper sold Gabriel south to the New Orleans slave market, where he was purchased by François Beaumont. The transition from Virginia to Louisiana, from being the subject of an eccentric master's educational experiment to being commercial property in the South's largest slave market, must have been traumatic for Gabriel. Yet the documentary evidence suggests he adapted with remarkable strategic intelligence, understanding immediately how to make himself valuable while avoiding the dangers that his education might provoke. A journal entry by François Beaumont, dated June 15, 1856, describes Gabriel's first weeks in the Beaumont household. Gabriel has proven himself indispensable in the counting house. His ability to translate commercial correspondence from French, Spanish, and Italian into English saves me considerable expense. I previously paid a translator for such work. More impressively, he understands the commercial and legal nuances of international trade agreements. When I was negotiating terms with a Spanish merchant regarding a shipment of Cuban sugar, Gabriel translated not just the words, but explained the implications of certain contract clauses, warning me about terms that might prove disadvantageous. Yet what strikes me most is his discretion. He performs his duties with perfect efficiency, but takes no pride in his abilities, shows no hint of presumption or superiority. He addresses me and all white persons with appropriate deference. He works in the counting house, but socializes only with other enslaved persons. He demonstrates his intelligence only when directly required to do so for business purposes, and even then he frames his insights as tentative suggestions rather than authoritative statements. I realize what he is doing. He is making himself useful enough to be valuable, but not so prominent as to be threatening. He understands that his survival depends on this balance. A slave who is too intelligent becomes dangerous. A slave who is usefully intelligent becomes valuable. Gabriel walks this line with a precision that itself demonstrates extraordinary intelligence, not just linguistic or scholarly intelligence, but social and strategic intelligence. Before we continue, tell us in the comments, have you ever had to deliberately appear less capable than you are to avoid threatening those in power over you? François Beaumont's observation reveals something crucial about Gabriel's situation and his response to it. Unlike some of the other cases we have documented, where extraordinary abilities were discovered accidentally or could not be hidden, Gabriel had both the awareness and the strategic capacity to manage the revelation of his abilities. He understood the danger of being too remarkable, too visible, too challenging to racial hierarchy. So he calibrated his public performance carefully, demonstrating competence without appearing to challenge white authority, providing value without claiming credit, surviving through a combination of genuine ability and theatrical submission. This strategic self-presentation becomes even more apparent in subsequent documents. A letter from François Beaumont to a business associate, dated August 1856, describes an incident that illustrates Gabriel's careful navigation of his impossible position. An amusing incident occurred today that demonstrates Gabriel's peculiar combination of capability and caution. A visiting merchant from France, a Monsieur Devereux from Lyon, was in the counting house discussing a complex shipping arrangement. Devereux spoke rapidly in French, using technical terminology and regional expressions that I struggled to follow fully. At one point, I had to ask him to slow down and repeat himself. Gabriel, who was working at a desk nearby preparing documents, said quietly in English, "Sir, if I may, Monsieur Devereux is offering to arrange insurance through Lloyd's of London at favourable rates if you agree to use his preferred shipping agent in Le Havre." He then translated the entire previous conversation, capturing details I had missed, clarifying ambiguities, and explaining commercial terms I had not fully understood. Devereux was astonished. He addressed Gabriel directly in French, asking where he had learned the language. Gabriel replied, in perfect French, that he had been permitted to study French texts as a young man, and that he found languages easy to learn. Devereux then tested him with increasingly complex French, switching between formal and colloquial registers, using obscure vocabulary and idiomatic expressions. Gabriel handled it all effortlessly. Then Devereux made a comment in rapid French to me, apparently assuming Gabriel would not understand. "Your slave speaks better French than most Parisians. Where did you find such a marvel? He could work as an interpreter in Europe if he were free." Before I could respond, Gabriel said quietly, still in French but with eyes downcast, "Monsieur is too kind. I speak French adequately for commercial purposes only. I am certain my French is quite inferior to that of educated Frenchmen. I merely do my best to serve my master's business needs." The response was perfect, acknowledging the compliment while immediately deflecting it, demonstrating linguistic ability while denying superior capability, performing humility while speaking flawlessly. Devereux understood the performance for what it was and looked uncomfortable, suddenly aware of the moral dimensions of slavery in a way that abstract discussions rarely provoke. After Devereux departed, I asked Gabriel why he had downplayed his obvious fluency. He replied, "Sir, if I appear too capable, people become uncomfortable. They start asking questions about how I learned such things, whether I might be dangerous, whether keeping me in New Orleans is wise. But if I appear merely adequate, useful, but not remarkable, then I can do my work without attracting dangerous attention. I wish only to serve you well and to avoid causing problems that might result in my being sold away from the city to a plantation, where my abilities would be wasted and my life would be considerably harsher." The calculation in his response was evident. Gabriel understands precisely how precarious his position is. He knows that being too remarkable could result in his being perceived as a threat and sold to brutal conditions in the cotton or sugar fields. So he moderates his public presentation, walking the narrow line between valuable and dangerous. This incident reveals the psychological burden Gabriel carried. Every interaction required strategic calculation. Every demonstration of ability had to be calibrated to avoid provoking fear or resentment. He could not simply be himself. He had to constantly perform a version of himself that white society could tolerate, a version that was competent but not threatening, valuable but not challenging, intelligent but not equal. The Beaumont Papers contain dozens of such incidents over the following years. Again and again, Gabriel demonstrated extraordinary linguistic, analytical, and strategic abilities, while simultaneously performing the deference and submission that his survival required. The documents paint a portrait of a brilliant mind, forced to operate under impossible constraints, finding ways to think and contribute while never openly challenging the system that enslaved him. But Gabriel's abilities extended beyond language and commerce. A letter from François Beaumont to his brother, dated November 1856, describes a discovery that would transform how the Beaumont family viewed their valuable property. "Henri, I have discovered that Gabriel possesses abilities beyond even the remarkable linguistic talents I previously documented. Yesterday, I was working on the accounts, attempting to reconcile several months of shipping records to identify where we were losing money on certain routes. The calculations were complex, involving exchange rates between multiple currencies, variable costs across different ports, seasonal price fluctuations, and transportation expenses. I had been working on the problem for days without reaching a satisfactory conclusion. Gabriel was in the counting house, preparing correspondence as usual. At one point I muttered aloud in frustration about the persistence of losses on the Mobile Havana route despite apparently favorable prices. Gabriel hesitated, then said quietly, "Sir, if I may suggest, I believe the problem is the timing of your purchases relative to the Cuban sugar harvest. You are buying at peak season when every merchant is purchasing, driving prices up. If you delayed your purchases by 6 weeks, the harvest glut would have passed, but supply would still be ample, giving you better prices. The 6-week delay would be compensated by the price differential." I was skeptical. This contradicted conventional wisdom in the trade. But I asked him to explain his reasoning. He proceeded to analyze the entire trade route from memory, citing specific shipping costs, typical purchase prices by season, average sale prices in Mobile, and transportation expenses. He had apparently memorized months of records and synthesized them into an analytical model, all in his head without paper or calculations. I checked his analysis against the actual records. He was correct in every detail. The losses on the Mobile Havana route stemmed precisely from the timing issue he identified. Implementing his suggestion could save us thousands of dollars annually. Henri, this Negro possesses not just linguistic ability, but analytical and mathematical intelligence of the highest order. He sees patterns in complex data that I miss. He synthesizes information across multiple sources and time frames. He understands commercial strategy at a level that exceeds most merchants I know. This creates a profound dilemma. Gabriel is now effectively managing significant aspects of our business through his suggestions and analyses. Yet I cannot publicly acknowledge this, cannot give him any formal authority or recognition, cannot even admit to business associates that I rely on the judgment of an enslaved man. To do so would be professional suicide. No merchant would trust someone who admitted taking business advice from a slave. So Gabriel must remain invisible even as he becomes indispensable. And I must live with the knowledge that much of my business success now depends on the intellect of a man I own as property, a man who could likely run a more successful commercial operation than my own if he were free, but who instead must frame every insight as a humble suggestion, every brilliant analysis as a tentative observation. François Beaumont's letter reveals the central paradox of Gabriel's situation. His intelligence made him valuable, but that same value depended on denying the full extent of his intelligence. He could not be recognized as an equal or superior intellect without destroying the racial hierarchy that justified his enslavement. So he had to remain simultaneously visible and invisible, visible enough to provide value, invisible enough not to threaten. This paradox intensified as Gabriel's role in the Beaumont commercial operation expanded. By 1857, according to the documentary evidence, Gabriel was effectively managing much of the firm's international correspondence, analyzing trade opportunities, negotiating with foreign merchants, while François Beaumont nominally made all decisions, and maintaining complex financial records. He had become essential to the business's profitability, but he had also become dangerous. The more valuable he became, the more questions people asked about him. Who was this remarkably capable enslaved man? How had he acquired such abilities? What did his existence suggest about the intellectual capacities of enslaved persons more generally? A journal entry by François Beaumont, dated March 15, 1857, captures the growing anxiety. I am increasingly troubled by the attention Gabriel attracts. Several business associates have commented on his linguistic abilities. Some have asked to borrow him for translation work, which I have refused. Partly because I need him, partly because I fear exposing him to situations I cannot control. But their interest makes me uneasy. What if someone reports to authorities that I possess an unusually educated slave, triggering investigations into whether I have violated laws against slave education? What if competitors attempt to purchase him, forcing me either to sell at enormous profit or to refuse and provoke questions about why I value him so highly? More troubling still, I sometimes catch Gabriel reading texts I have not given him, legal treatises, political philosophy, newspapers discussing the sectional crisis between North and South. He's educating himself continuously, absorbing information at a rate I cannot fully monitor. What is he thinking as he reads about debates over slavery's future? What conclusions is he drawing? Does he see himself as permanently enslaved? Or does he envision scenarios of freedom, perhaps even of rebellion? I have never felt physically threatened by Gabriel. His demeanor remains deferential, and his temperament seems gentle. But I am increasingly aware that I have in my household a man whose intellectual capabilities far exceed my own, who understands my business better than I do, who speaks more languages than I speak, and who must surely resent his condition even if he never expresses that resentment. The power dynamic between us is maintained only by legal and social structures, not by any natural superiority on my part. This knowledge makes me profoundly uncomfortable. Beaumont's discomfort reveals something important: the recognition that racial hierarchy was artificial, that it required constant enforcement precisely because it was not natural or inevitable. Gabriel's presence made this artificiality impossible to ignore. Every time Beaumont relied on Gabriel's judgment, every time Gabriel demonstrated superior knowledge or ability, the fiction of white supremacy was exposed as exactly that, a fiction. But fictions, when supported by law and violence, have real power. And that power would soon be directed at Gabriel in ways that would test his strategic intelligence to its limits. In April 1857, a New Orleans physician named Dr. Samuel Morton published an article in a local medical journal titled "Observations on the Intellectual Capacity of the Negro Race." The article argued, using measurements of skull size and shape, that Africans and their descendants possessed inherently limited intellectual capacity compared to Europeans. The article was part of a broader pseudo-scientific literature attempting to provide biological justification for slavery and racial hierarchy. Gabriel read this article. The Beaumont Papers include a copy with marginal notes in Gabriel's handwriting. His annotations are carefully reasoned rebuttals of Morton's methodology and conclusions, demonstrating understanding of anatomy, statistics, and logical argument. But what makes these annotations remarkable is that Gabriel apparently showed them to François Beaumont, who recorded the interaction in his journal. April 22, 1857, Gabriel brought me Dr. Morton's recent article with annotations he had written in the margins. I was initially alarmed that he had marked my copy of the journal, but my alarm turned to fascination as I read his notes. Gabriel had systematically dismantled Morton's arguments, pointing out logical fallacies, methodological errors, and unwarranted conclusions. His reasoning was sophisticated, and his tone was respectful but firm. He was not merely objecting to Morton's racism, but demonstrating that the science itself was flawed. I asked Gabriel why he felt compelled to write these annotations. He replied, "Sir, Dr. Morton claims that people like me cannot think in complex ways, cannot reason abstractly, cannot master languages or mathematics. Yet I do all of these things. Either Dr. Morton is wrong, or I am some kind of singular exception that proves his general rule. If I am an exception, then my existence means nothing for others of my race. But, sir, I do not believe I'm exceptional among my people. I believe that if others had the opportunities I have had, access to books, time to study, encouragement rather than punishment for learning, many would demonstrate similar abilities. What Dr. Morton attributes to biological limits, I attribute to social deprivation. My existence disproves his theory, and I wanted to document that disproof." I was struck by the careful way Gabriel framed his argument. He did not claim biological equality outright. That would have been too threatening. Instead, he positioned his abilities as evidence against Morton's specific claims, leaving the broader implications unstated but obvious. He was making an argument for his people's potential while maintaining the deferential posture his survival required. I asked what he hoped to achieve by showing me these annotations. He replied, "I do not expect you to publish them, sir. I know that would be impossible. But I wanted you to know that I think about these things, that I have responses to the theories used to justify my condition. And I wanted you to see that those responses are rational and evidence-based, not emotional or resentful. Perhaps someday, when circumstances change, such arguments will matter. For now, I simply needed to make them, even if only privately." I told Gabriel I would preserve his annotations, but could not share them publicly. He thanked me and returned to his work. But the conversation has stayed with me. Gabriel knows exactly what his existence means. He is living proof that the intellectual justifications for slavery are false. Yet he also knows that this proof means nothing in a society determined to maintain slavery regardless of evidence. So he documents his intelligence and his reasoning, not for immediate effect, but as testimony for a future he believes will come, when such evidence might matter. Gabriel's annotated copy of Morton's article, preserved in the Beaumont Papers, represents something remarkable, a direct intellectual rebuttal of scientific racism by an enslaved person, written in 1857, demonstrating understanding of scientific methodology and logical argument. The annotations show Gabriel not just as someone with unusual abilities, but as a critical thinker engaging with the ideological systems used to oppress him, dismantling those systems through reason, even though he lacked the power to change the society they sustained. But reason alone could not protect Gabriel from the escalating crisis over slavery that was pushing the nation toward war. By 1858, the political situation in the United States had become increasingly volatile. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, John Brown's activities, and the Lincoln-Douglas debates all contributed to a sense that sectional conflict over slavery would soon reach a breaking point. In New Orleans, these national tensions played out in local debates about the future of slavery, the possibility of secession, and the dangers posed by educated slaves and free people of color. In this charged atmosphere, Gabriel's prominence in the Beaumont commercial operation attracted unwanted attention. A letter from a New Orleans merchant named Robert Caldwell to François Beaumont, dated June 1858, makes the threat explicit. Beaumont, I write as a friend and business associate to warn you about dangerous talk circulating regarding your Negro, Gabriel. Multiple merchants have commented on his unusual abilities and education. Some view this as evidence of your skill in training valuable property, but others, and I include myself in this category, view it as evidence of dangerous indulgence that threatens social order. We are entering a period when discipline must be maintained strictly. The abolitionist agitation from the North, the possibility of slave insurrections, the presence of educated Negroes and uppity free-coloreds, all of these threaten our society's stability. In such times, we cannot afford to have enslaved persons who demonstrate intelligence equal to white men, who read political texts, who understand commercial operations, who might use their abilities to forge papers, organize escapes, or even plan rebellions. I suggest you consider selling Gabriel to a buyer in the Deep South, Mississippi or Alabama cotton country, where his linguistic abilities will be wasted, but where he will be safely distant from New Orleans' cosmopolitan influences. Alternatively, you might impose stricter controls on his activities, denying him access to books and newspapers, limiting his work to purely mechanical tasks that do not require thinking. If you fail to act, I fear others will force your hand. There is talk of petitioning the city authorities to investigate whether Gabriel has been illegally educated in violation of slave codes. Such an investigation would be unpleasant for both of you. I urge you to address this situation before it becomes a crisis. Caldwell's letter represents the threat that intelligent enslaved persons always faced. They challenged the ideological assumptions necessary to maintain slavery, and therefore they had to be suppressed regardless of their value. Gabriel's abilities made him commercially valuable to François Beaumont, but they made him socially dangerous to a slave-holding society, increasingly paranoid about threats to its survival. François Beaumont's response to this threat is documented in his journal. He understood that he could not protect Gabriel indefinitely, that the social pressure to suppress or remove Gabriel would only intensify. But he also valued Gabriel both commercially and increasingly personally. The journal entries suggest that Beaumont had developed something approaching respect for Gabriel's intellect, even as he continued to hold him in bondage. The solution Beaumont arrived at was characteristically calculated and morally ambiguous. A journal entry dated July 1858 explains, I have decided to send Gabriel to France. I have business interests in Lyon that require oversight, and Gabriel's linguistic abilities make him ideal for managing those interests. More importantly, removing him from New Orleans removes him from the immediate scrutiny of those who view him as a threat. In France, where slavery does not exist, Gabriel will technically be free, but he will also be financially dependent on me. in a foreign country where he has no resources or connections. He will manage my business interests there, and his compensation will be modest but sufficient for basic survival. This arrangement satisfies multiple objectives. It protects Gabriel from being sold to brutal conditions in the Cotton South. It removes him from New Orleans, where his presence has become controversial. It allows me to continue benefiting from his abilities, and it maintains his dependence on me even while he is technically free. I have explained this arrangement to Gabriel. He understands that accepting it means leaving behind everyone he knows in New Orleans, living in a country he has never visited, depending entirely on me for his livelihood. He also understands that refusing means I will be forced to sell him, likely to exactly the kind of brutal plantation environment I am offering to help him avoid. Given these choices, he has agreed to go to France. I tell myself this is a humanitarian gesture. I'm essentially granting him freedom by sending him to a country where slavery is not recognized. But I know the truth is more complicated. I am solving my own problem, the controversy Gabriel causes in New Orleans, while maintaining my ability to profit from his abilities. He will be free in law, but bound in practice, dependent on my continuing support, and therefore obligated to continue working for my interests. This is exploitation dressed up as kindness, and I am not proud of it, but I see no better alternative that preserves both Gabriel's safety and my own interests. Gabriel departed for Lyon, France in September 1858. The Beaumont Papers contain a letter Gabriel wrote to François Beaumont from aboard the ship during the Atlantic crossing, dated September 20th, 1858. The letter provides rare insight into Gabriel's own thoughts and feelings, expressed with the careful balance between honesty and deference that characterized all his interactions with Beaumont. Monsieur Beaumont, I write to you from the Atlantic crossing to express my gratitude for the opportunity you have provided. I understand the controversy my presence in New Orleans created, and I understand that removing me solves problems for you, while also protecting me from worse alternatives. I do not mistake this arrangement for pure benevolence. I know I am being sent to France because it serves your interests as well as mine. But I am grateful nonetheless. You have treated me with more decency than most enslaved persons experience. You recognize my abilities rather than suppressing them entirely. You allowed me to use my mind rather than forcing me to pretend I had none. These are not small things, even if they were mixed with continued bondage and exploitation. I go to France with mixed feelings. I am grateful to leave behind the constant performance of deference, the need to calibrate every word and gesture to avoid appearing threatening. In France, I will not be property in law, and that legal freedom matters even if practical dependence remains. But I also leave behind friends, familiar places, the only world I have known. I go to a foreign country where I will be alone, dependent on your generosity, without community or support beyond what you provide. Yet I also go with hope. Perhaps in France, I can develop abilities more fully, can think and work without constant surveillance, can begin to imagine a future beyond bondage and dependence. Perhaps the distance will allow me to become someone other than Gabriel, the remarkable slave. Perhaps I can simply become Gabriel, a man who happens to have facility with languages and numbers, whose intelligence is not a threat or a curiosity, but simply a fact. I will manage your lion interests faithfully. You have given me this opportunity, and I will justify your trust in my abilities. But I also look forward to discovering who I might become when freed from the constant need to hide what I am. That discovery will be its own form of freedom, regardless of my formal legal status. I remain your servant, though I hope someday to be simply your associate. With respect and gratitude, Gabriel. The letter reveals Gabriel's sophisticated understanding of his situation, neither entirely free nor entirely enslaved, not quite liberated, but no longer simply property. He understood that Beaumont's motives were mixed, that the arrangement served commercial interests while also providing him opportunities. He accepted this moral ambiguity while also articulating hope for a future where his intelligence could exist without constant suppression. Gabriel arrived in Lyon in October 1858 and began managing Beaumont's textile trading interests there. The subsequent correspondence between Gabriel and François Beaumont, preserved in the Beaumont Papers, documents his activities in France and provides evidence of his continuing intellectual development, now freed from the most oppressive constraints of slavery. A letter from Gabriel to François Beaumont, dated December 1858, describes his first months in France. "Monsieur, I write to report on the Lyon business and to share observations about my situation here. The textile trade is progressing well. I have renegotiated contracts with 3 suppliers, achieving better terms than your previous agent obtained. I have also identified new potential markets in Germany and northern Italy, where your goods might be sold profitably. But beyond business matters, I must describe the psychological adjustment I'm experiencing. In France, I'm not property. No one here knows my history as an enslaved person. I present myself simply as an American businessman managing French interests. When I speak French fluently, people assume I was educated in France. When I negotiate contracts, no one questions whether I have authority to do so. I interact with merchants, bankers, and traders as an equal, without performing deference, without calculating every word for safety. The relief of this is difficult to express. For the first time in my life, I can think without constantly monitoring how my thinking is perceived. I can speak without weighing whether my words will be seen as presumptuous. I can simply be intelligent without that intelligence being viewed as threatening or impossible or unnatural. Yet I also feel unmoored. For 19 years I learned to navigate bondage, to survive through strategic submission while preserving my sense of self. Now that the immediate threat is removed, I find myself uncertain about who I am without that threat to define me. Am I Gabriel the enslaved man performing freedom? Or am I Gabriel the free man learning to be himself? The psychological adjustment is more difficult than I anticipated. I have also begun to educate myself more systematically. Without fear of punishment for reading, I have obtained books on mathematics, philosophy, political theory, and science. I spend my evenings studying, driven by the desire to develop abilities that were suppressed during bondage. I find that I can learn even more rapidly than I realized. Freed from the psychological weight of bondage, my mind seems to operate more efficiently. I do not forget that I remain dependent on your support, that my freedom is contingent on your continued willingness to employ me. But I hope to reach a point where I can support myself independently, where my abilities translate to genuine economic independence. That would be true freedom. Not just freedom from legal bondage, but freedom to direct my own life. I am grateful for this opportunity, even as I work toward the day when I will not need to depend on your kindness. With respect, Gabriel. The letter shows Gabriel thriving intellectually while also honestly acknowledging the incomplete nature of his freedom. He was not legally enslaved anymore, but he was economically dependent, still in a subordinate relationship to François Beaumont, still constrained by circumstances, even if those constraints were less severe than American slavery. Over the following years, Gabriel's letters document his continuing intellectual development and his gradual movement toward genuine independence. He taught himself German and Portuguese, expanding his linguistic repertoire to 6 European languages plus Latin. He studied mathematics and economics systematically, developing theoretical understanding to complement his practical commercial experience. He began writing articles under a pseudonym for French commercial journals, analyzing international trade patterns and economic policy, articles that were published and praised, though no one knew they were written by a formerly enslaved man from Louisiana. By 1860, According to the correspondence, Gabriel had accumulated enough capital from his work in Lyon to contemplate genuine economic independence. A letter to François Beaumont, dated March 1860, announces this development. Monsieur, I write to inform you of my intention to establish an independent commercial operation. I have saved sufficient capital to rent office space and to finance initial trade transactions. I intend to continue handling your Lyon interests under contract rather than as your direct employee, which will provide you the same service while allowing me to develop my own business. I do this not from ingratitude. You provided me the opportunity that made this possible, but from necessity for my own development. As long as I remain your employee, I remain in some sense subordinate, dependent, not fully autonomous. To complete the journey from bondage to freedom, I must become genuinely independent, answerable to contracts rather than to a master, however benevolent. I hope we can maintain a business relationship and perhaps even friendship as circumstances evolve. You took a risk in recognizing my abilities rather than suppressing them, in sending me to France rather than selling me to brutal conditions. That risk created this opportunity. I will always be grateful, even as I move beyond needing your patronage. I also want to tell you something I could never say while I was your property. Your willingness to recognize my intelligence, even while continuing to hold me in bondage, created moral obligations you may not have recognized. You benefited from abilities you did not fully acknowledge or compensate. You built commercial success partially on my intellectual labor while denying me credit for that labor. This was exploitation, even if it was less brutal than plantation slavery. I do not say this with anger. I survived by accepting the compromises necessary for survival. But I say it because I want you to understand what the system you participated in actually meant for those of us whose intelligence made us valuable property rather than equals. Perhaps someday you will use your influence to challenge that system, to argue that slavery is wrong not just when it involves physical brutality, but also when it involves the appropriation of human intelligence without acknowledgement or just compensation. I wish you well. I hope we remain in contact as I establish my independence, with respect and with hope that you will understand these truths, Gabriel. Gabriel's letter represents something remarkable, a formerly enslaved person directly challenging his former owner about the moral dimensions of their relationship, articulating exploitation even while acknowledging that the relationship could have been worse. The letter is respectful but honest, grateful but also critical, accepting historical reality while also calling for accountability. François Beaumont's response, preserved in the Beaumont Papers, shows a man grappling with uncomfortable truths. Gabriel, your letter unsettled me deeply, as I suppose you intended. You are correct that I benefited from your abilities without providing full compensation or acknowledgement. You are correct that even humane slavery remains exploitation. You are correct that I should have done more to challenge the system rather than simply participating in it less brutally than others. I have no adequate defense except to say that I was raised in this system, that I accepted its assumptions uncritically until your presence forced me to question them, and that even after questioning began, I lacked the courage to act on my doubts. I let economic interests and social pressure override moral obligations. This is not a defense, but an admission. I support your move toward independence. You have earned it through your abilities and your labor. I hope we remain in contact, not as master and servant. We never truly were, despite the legal fiction, but as business associates who share a complicated history. I will do what I can to challenge slavery's injustices, though I confess I do not know what is within my power. Perhaps simply telling your story, acknowledging your abilities and their implications would be a start. If your intelligence disproves racial theories, then perhaps documenting that intelligence serves some purpose. I wish you success in your independent venture. You will thrive. You have abilities that exceed those of most men I have known, regardless of race. The world you are entering in France will not fully recognize those abilities because they will not know where you came from or what you overcame. But I know, and I will remember, with respect and with regret for not having done more. François Beaumont. Gabriel established an independent commercial operation in Lyon in April 1860. For the next several years, he operated as a broker and translator in international trade, building a successful business based on his linguistic abilities and commercial knowledge. The documentary record shows him interacting with European merchants as an equal, his intelligence finally recognized without the burden of his history as enslaved property. But Gabriel never forgot his origins, and he never stopped thinking about others who remained in bondage. A letter from Gabriel to an abolitionist organization in Paris, dated November 1860, reveals his continuing engagement with the slavery question. "Gentlemen, I write to offer my services to your efforts to combat American slavery. I am a formerly enslaved person who obtained freedom through unusual circumstances. I possess abilities that directly contradict claims about Negro intellectual inferiority. I can speak 6 European languages fluently, understand commercial law and mathematics, and operate successfully in European business circles. My existence proves that enslaved persons' apparent lack of education reflects deprivation of opportunity rather than biological limits. I am willing to speak publicly about my experiences, to write articles documenting the intellectual capabilities of enslaved persons, to serve as living proof that racial theories justifying slavery are false. I understand this public role would expose my history and might complicate my business relationships, but I believe I have an obligation to use my unusual situation to challenge the system that enslaved me and that continues to enslave millions. I offer this service not from any particular heroism, but from recognition that my abilities created opportunities that others equally capable never received. If my example can help delegitimize slavery, then whatever discomfort or cost I experience is justified. I await your guidance on how I might best contribute to your cause. Respectfully, Gabriel Prosper." Gabriel's letter to abolitionists marks a turning point, a decision to make himself visible, to use his story publicly, to transform his personal experience into political testimony against slavery. This was not without risk. Publicly identifying as a formerly enslaved person could damage his business reputation and subject him to racism, even in France. But Gabriel apparently decided that his moral obligations outweighed personal interests. The documentary record shows that Gabriel did become involved with French abolitionist circles in the early 1860s. He gave speeches in Paris describing his experiences and abilities, demonstrating linguistic facility and intellectual capability that contradicted pro-slavery arguments. He wrote articles for abolitionist publications under his own name, documenting how slavery suppressed rather than reflected intellectual capacity. He became, in essence, a living rebuttal to scientific racism, proof that when given opportunity, formerly enslaved persons could achieve at the highest levels. But the outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861 transformed the context of these abolitionist activities. What had been a moral crusade against a persistent institution became a practical question about the war's aims and potential outcomes. Gabriel, following the war from France, saw opportunity in the crisis. A letter from Gabriel to François Beaumont, dated July 1862, expresses his intention to return to America. "François, I write to inform you of my decision to return to America. The Civil War creates unprecedented opportunity to challenge slavery practically rather than just theoretically. I intend to offer my services to the Union cause, particularly my linguistic abilities, which might be useful for communication with French interests in the war. More importantly, I believe the war will end with emancipation, if not immediately then, eventually. When that happens, millions of formerly enslaved persons will need education, economic opportunity, and advocates who understand both their capabilities and the systems that oppress them. I want to be part of that transformation. I want to help build institutions that develop the abilities slavery suppressed. I do not return from any simple optimism. I know emancipation will not immediately create equality, that racial prejudice will persist long after legal bondage ends. But I return with hope that this crisis creates space for change, that the impossible might become possible, that people like me might help shape a future less constrained by the racial hierarchies that defined the past. I am grateful for your role in my journey. You recognized abilities that others would have suppressed. You provided opportunities that others would have denied. Our relationship was complicated and morally ambiguous, but it was also human in ways that pure brutality is not. I do not forget that complexity, even as I work toward a world where such complex compromises are no longer necessary. I wish you well. Perhaps when the war ends, we will meet again in a transformed America. With hope and gratitude, Gabriel. Gabriel returned to the United States in September 1862 and offered his services to the Union Army. Military records show he was employed as a translator and intelligence analyst, using his linguistic abilities to decode intercepted Confederate communications, translate correspondence with French interests sympathetic to the Confederacy, and analyze commercial patterns that might reveal blockade-running activities. But more significantly, Gabriel became involved in efforts to educate formerly enslaved persons as Union forces liberated Confederate territory. A report from a Union officer, Colonel James Harrison, dated March 1863, describes Gabriel's educational activities in occupied New Orleans. I write to report on the activities of Gabriel Prosper, a freedman employed by the Army as translator, and now also serving as teacher in the freedmen's schools established in New Orleans. Prosper has developed a remarkably effective program for teaching formerly enslaved adults to read and write. His method emphasizes rapid skill development using practical texts, newspapers, commercial documents, legal forms that immediately demonstrate the value of literacy. More impressively, Prosper has identified several students who demonstrate advanced intellectual abilities and has begun providing them with more sophisticated education, languages, mathematics, sciences. He argues, persuasively in my view, that there are likely hundreds or thousands of formerly enslaved persons with latent abilities comparable to educated whites, abilities that were suppressed by slavery, but that might be developed rapidly with proper education. Prosper himself is remarkable, fluent in 6 languages, commercially sophisticated, intellectually acute. He serves as proof of his own arguments about enslaved persons' capabilities. Some have suggested that he should be appointed to more prominent positions in the occupation administration, but he prefers to work directly with freed people, teaching and identifying talent. I recommend that Prosper's educational methods be studied and potentially replicated elsewhere as we liberate additional territory. His approach seems uniquely effective at rapidly developing skills and confidence among people emerging from bondage. Gabriel's educational work during the Civil War represents his attempt to use his abilities to benefit others who had experienced slavery's intellectual suppression. He was not content simply to have escaped bondage himself. He wanted to create opportunities for others, to develop the latent abilities he believed existed throughout the enslaved population. But Gabriel's most significant contribution during this period may have been his writing. Between 1863 and 1865, he published a series of articles in northern newspapers and journals, documenting his experiences and making arguments about slavery, race, and intellectual capacity. These articles, signed with his name, represent some of the most sophisticated intellectual analyses of slavery produced by formerly enslaved persons during the war years. One article published in the Atlantic Monthly in December 1863, titled "On the Suppression of Intelligence in Bondage," makes arguments that anticipated much later scholarship on slavery's psychological dimensions. The greatest crime of slavery is not the physical brutality, though that is severe, nor is it the separation of families, though that is traumatic. The greatest crime is the systematic suppression of human intelligence, the forcing of capable minds into performances of incapacity, the requirement that thinking persons pretend not to think. I speak from experience. I possessed abilities that challenged racial theories justifying slavery. I could learn languages rapidly, understand complex systems, analyze information sophisticated. But possessing these abilities in bondage meant performing their opposite, appearing simple, confused, incapable. Every day required this performance. Every interaction demanded calibrated submission. The psychological cost cannot be overstated. To spend your life pretending to be less than you are, to watch others assume you lack abilities you possess, to survive by hiding your mind. This damages the self in ways physical violence does not. It makes you doubt your own intelligence, even as you exercise it secretly. It fractures identity into public performance and private reality. Slavery did this not just to me, but to millions. How many possessed abilities that were never developed because development was punished? How many learned to suppress curiosity because curiosity brought danger? How many internalized the lie of their own inferiority because performing that lie was necessary for survival? Emancipation must address this. It is not enough to free bodies if minds remain imprisoned by years of enforced suppression. Freedom must include education, opportunity to develop abilities, recognition that intelligence exists independent of race. This will require not just legal changes, but psychological reconstruction, both for formerly enslaved persons who must unlearn survival strategies that required hiding intelligence, and for white Americans who must abandon comfortable theories of racial intellectual hierarchy. I do not know if this reconstruction is possible, but I know it is necessary. A society built on lies about human capacity cannot endure. Truth must eventually assert itself, however painful that assertion might be. Gabriel's article represents a sophisticated analysis of slavery's psychological dimensions, written by someone who experienced those dimensions directly. The fact that such analysis was published in a major northern journal demonstrates that Gabriel had successfully positioned himself as an intellectual voice in debates about slavery and race, no longer hiding his abilities, but using them publicly to challenge the systems that had tried to suppress them. The Civil War ended in April 1865 with Union victory and the abolition of slavery. Gabriel, now aged 28, faced the question that all formerly enslaved persons faced. What does freedom mean practically? How do you build a life in a society that has legally freed you but still considers you inferior? How do you develop abilities that were suppressed for decades while also meeting immediate survival needs? Gabriel's choice was to remain in the South, working with Freedmen's Bureau efforts to establish schools and economic opportunities for freed people. Letters and reports from 1865-1867 show him traveling throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, teaching, organizing schools, and identifying talented individuals who might benefit from advanced education. A letter from Gabriel to a former abolitionist colleague in Paris, dated October 1866, describes both his work and his frustrations. The work here is simultaneously inspiring and heartbreaking. I meet freed people every day who possess intelligence and ability that slavery suppressed, who are hungry for education and opportunity, who could achieve remarkable things if given chance and resources. I have identified students with linguistic ability comparable to my own, with mathematical talent exceeding mine, with analytical capability that would credit any university, but the resources available are pathetically inadequate. The schools we establish are underfunded, poorly equipped, and often opposed by local whites who view black education as threatening. The teachers are too few and often poorly trained themselves. The economic opportunities for educated freed people remain limited. Even those we educate to high levels struggle to find work that uses their abilities, because white employers refuse to hire them for anything beyond manual labor. Most frustrating is the persistence of racial theories even after slavery's defeat. White Americans, even in the North, still largely believe in black intellectual inferiority. They interpret every educated freed person as an exception rather than as evidence against the rule. When I speak 6 languages and understand complex systems, they say I am unusually gifted. They do not conclude that perhaps others would be similarly capable with similar opportunities. I'm beginning to understand that legal emancipation is only the first step in a much longer struggle. We must not just free people from bondage, but free white Americans from the psychological need to believe in racial hierarchy. This may be more difficult than winning the war itself. Gabriel's letter captures the central challenge of Reconstruction. Legal freedom did not automatically create social or economic equality, and the ideological assumptions that had justified slavery persisted long after slavery's end. Gabriel had escaped bondage and developed his abilities fully, but he remained an exception rather than being seen as proof of broader capability. The documentary record of Gabriel Prosper becomes increasingly fragmentary after 1867. He appears sporadically in Freedmen's Bureau records, in newspaper accounts of educational efforts, in correspondence with former abolitionist colleagues. But there is no comprehensive chronicle of his later life, no definitive account of his ultimate fate. What can be documented suggests that Gabriel continued educational and commercial work through the 1870s and 1880s. A business directory from New Orleans in 1875 lists Gabriel Prosper, commercial translator, international trade broker, suggesting he had resumed commercial activities while continuing educational advocacy. A newspaper article from 1880 mentions Professor Gabriel Prosper teaching at a freedmen's school in New Orleans, indicating he maintained educational commitments. The last definitive reference to Gabriel appears in a letter written in 1891 by a former student, a young black man named Marcus Washington, who had studied with Gabriel in the late 1860s and gone on to become a teacher himself. Washington wrote, "I learned from Professor Gabriel Prosper that intelligence is not the privilege of any race, but the potential of all humanity. He taught me languages and mathematics, but more importantly, he taught me that my mind was not limited by the circumstances of my birth, that abilities could be developed, that the racial theories used to justify my parents' enslavement were lies. Professor Prosper has passed away. I do not know the exact date or circumstances. He had grown reclusive in recent years, disappointed perhaps by the slow pace of progress, frustrated by the persistence of racial barriers even after formal freedom. But his legacy lives on in every student he taught, every person he inspired to develop abilities that society claimed they did not possess. I wish the world knew his full story. How a brilliant mind survived bondage through strategic concealment, how he found freedom and used it to benefit others, how he proved through his existence that the intellectual justifications for slavery were false. But his story remains largely unknown, and perhaps that is fitting. He spent so much of his life forced to hide his abilities that even in freedom he never fully emerged into public recognition. He worked quietly, taught privately, advocated persistently, but without seeking fame. Yet his impact was profound. Every person he taught, every mind he helped develop, represents a small victory against the system that tried to suppress both him and us. He showed us that we were capable, and in doing so, he gave us permission to become what we might be. I will remember him. I will teach my students what he taught me. And perhaps, generations from now, historians will discover his story and understand that this man, this enslaved boy who taught himself languages in secret, who survived by hiding genius, who used freedom to educate others, represents something important about American history, about the survival of intelligence under oppression, about the persistence of human capacity even when society tries to destroy it. Marcus Washington's letter, dated 1891, is the last confirmed reference to Gabriel Prosper in the historical record. If Washington is correct about Gabriel's death, it likely occurred in the late 1880s or early 1890s, when Gabriel would have been in his 50s. But there is no death certificate, no obituary in major newspapers, no grave marker that has been identified. Like so many formerly enslaved persons, Gabriel left the world with little official documentation, his death as unmarked as his birth had been. Yet the Beaumont Papers preserve extensive evidence of his life and abilities. François Beaumont's journal and correspondence, Gabriel's own letters, testimonies from those who witnessed his capabilities, military records documenting his Civil War service, articles he published under his name, all of this creates a detailed portrait of a remarkable mind that survived slavery, achieved freedom, and spent that freedom working to develop abilities in others that slavery had tried to suppress. What does Gabriel Prosper's story tell us? It tells us that slavery suppressed intelligence systematically and deliberately, that enslaved persons often possessed abilities that were hidden to survive, that the intellectual justifications for slavery were contradicted by the actual capabilities of enslaved persons. It tells us that freedom for people like Gabriel was always incomplete, legally free but economically constrained, intellectually recognized by some but dismissed as exceptional by most, able to develop abilities but rarely able to receive full credit or opportunity for those abilities. It tells us that strategic intelligence was as important as intellectual intelligence for survival under slavery, that Gabriel survived not just by being brilliant, but by being smart about when and how to reveal that brilliance, by calibrating his public performance to avoid threatening those with power over him. It tells us that even after emancipation, the psychological and social legacies of slavery persisted, that racial hierarchy survived legal freedom, that opportunities remained limited, that recognition remained partial. But it also tells us something else, something perhaps more important, that human intelligence persists even under the most oppressive conditions, that minds denied education will educate themselves if given any opportunity, that abilities suppressed will resurface when suppression lessens, that the human capacity for thought, learning and growth cannot be permanently destroyed, only temporarily contained. Gabriel Prosper spent his youth forced to hide his genius to survive slavery. He spent his middle years working to ensure that others would not have to hide theirs. He spent his final years disappointed perhaps by the slow pace of change, frustrated maybe by the persistence of racism, but also knowing that he had made a difference, that he had taught students who would teach others, that he had planted seeds that might eventually grow into the world he envisioned. His name is not famous, his story is barely known. He left no major published works, founded no institutions that bear his name, achieved no recognition in standard histories. But he lived brilliantly despite oppression, survived bondage through intelligence, used freedom to benefit others, and left behind testimony in the Beaumont Papers and in the memories of students like Marcus Washington. That genius can emerge from anywhere, can survive anything, can persist against every effort to suppress it. That testimony matters. Gabriel Prosper's story is not just historical curiosity, it is evidence that demands recognition, proof that challenges comfortable assumptions, testimony that indicts the systems that tried to destroy minds like his. The greatest tragedy of Gabriel Prosper's life may not be what happened to him. He ultimately achieved freedom and used it purposefully. But what did not happen? He was never fully recognized during his lifetime for what he was and what he proved. His brilliance was acknowledged privately by a few, but never celebrated publicly by many. His achievements were known to those he helped directly, but never became part of broader historical narratives. He spent his life demonstrating that racial theories were false, yet those theories persisted and persist still. But his life also demonstrates something else, that you do not need recognition to matter, that work done quietly can have profound impact, that teaching one student who teaches others creates ripples that extend far beyond what you can see, that living with integrity and using your abilities to benefit others is itself a form of triumph over systems that tried to prevent you from doing so. Gabriel Prosper's brilliance survived oppression. That survival itself is victory. That he used his survival to help others survive and thrive is legacy. That we can recover his story from fragmentary documents and bear witness to what he was and what he proved is obligation. All black people must know this story, not because it is exceptional, though it is remarkable, but because it is exemplary. Gabriel was not the only enslaved person with such abilities. He was simply one of the few whose abilities were documented enough to be recovered by history. For every Gabriel whose story survives, there were hundreds or thousands whose stories were lost entirely, whose brilliance was suppressed completely, whose potential was destroyed before it could be demonstrated. Gabriel's story stands for all of theirs. His documented genius testifies to the undocumented genius that slavery tried to erase. His survival of oppression represents the survival of black intellectual tradition, despite every effort to destroy it. His legacy of teaching and advocacy connects to the ongoing struggle for recognition and opportunity that continues to this day. Remember Gabriel Prosper. Remember what he proved. Remember what his existence cost him and what he achieved despite those costs. Remember that brilliance can emerge from anywhere, survive anything, and persist against all efforts to suppress it. And remember that the struggle he fought for recognition of black intellectual capacity, for opportunity to develop abilities, for a world where genius is acknowledged regardless of its source, that struggle continues. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you understand something you didn't before, share it widely. Every black person needs to know that brilliance like Gabriel's existed then and exists now, that our ancestors' intelligence was suppressed but never destroyed, that the lies told to justify our oppression were contradicted by people like Gabriel who proved those lies false. Subscribe for more forgotten histories of black excellence that refuse to be erased. And remember, when they tell you who you are, remember who we've always been: brilliant, capable, resilient, and unstoppable.